The cycle of government spending starts with the government spends money first into the economy, and then, on the other end, taxes it back out. The problem is that people think of money as if it's a chunk of gold or a piece of paper, right? Which is the wrong analogy. If you get people onto a better analogy, then they'll make the connections themselves. So it's like the analogy that I prefer people to use is more like a gift card or a coupon, right? Like Mosler says there, the government issues tax credits, right? If you can get people to think with that analogy, to think like, oh yeah, stores, when they sell gift cards, they don't collect gift cards from somebody they they don't collect the gift cards and then sell them. They just sell them and then they collect them back. Like, if you get people to think of money as a gift card or something like that, then people start making those connections for themselves.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, Sam Levey, talking about how modern money systems work. That for a long time now, or as John Maynard Keynes put it, for the past 4,000 years at least, we've had modern money. Modern money is not a commodity dug out of the ground or a crop that gets scarce or abundant depending on the weather. In the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, to name a few, money is issued by the government when it spends, and it's unissued by the government when it collects taxes, just like coupons issued by a chain store. Nations, the people in them, and the people elected to govern them always seem to forget this simple fact of fiat currency when it comes to the public good. So this period of austerity we're living through in the UK is based on the idea that our government has run out of money, which is impossible because the UK government creates its own currency. But that's a fact that government officials remember in a hurry when they need to fight a war, to the extent that if they can't find a conventional war, they'll just declare war on a word like terror. So here in 2019, humans find themselves in a war for survival against climate catastrophe, and with a solid proposal to win it, the Green New Deal. And predictably, the how you going to pay for it crowd have forgotten how the money system works. So here with a reminder is scholar and research fellow at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, Sam Levey, who recently published a working paper entitled Modern Money and the War Treasury, focusing on the US Treasury during World War II. And he's going to talk us through that right now. It's a two-parter, and part 2 will be next week. Thanks for listening. Hi, Sam Levey. Welcome to the MMT Podcast. How are you?
Hi, great to be here. Thank you. How are you guys?
Great. Well, yeah.
You know, the country's burning down.
Apart from that small detail, we're fantastic, but
I think we can overlook that.
Sam, we really wanted to talk about your recent paper about the Treasury's thinking in the US in World War II. But first of all, let's start with who you are, because you are known on Twitter as an educator.
You're a legend on Twitter.
You're a Twitter legend called Deficit Owls, plural. You can't just be a deficit owl. Imagine, in fact,
right.
Because that was Stephanie Kelton's original Twitter handle anyway, wasn't it?
Oh, was it?
I think it was, deficit
That's
owl.
true.
Yeah.
Although I think by the time I started on Twitter, she had abandoned it.
Yes, yeah.
Oh, fair enough.
So, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, Sam?
Sure. Well, I am a graduate student in the PhD program in economics here at the University of Missouri, Kansas City in the U.S. And so this is it's a heterodox department. It's where MMT basically was born. Randall Ray taught here, Stephanie Kelton. We still have Matthew Forstater, Scott Fulweiler, the whole gang. It's a kind of a heterodox department through and through. So it's a great place to be.
Is that the first place where there was is that still the only place where you can learn modern monetary theory?
I don't know about that, because I would imagine, well, we have graduates who have finished their degrees here and gone out to other places to teach. And then, Bill Mitchell is in Australia and he teaches there. And Stephanie Kelton teaches an MMT course at Stony Brook in New York. But we are one of the few places, count on, less than one hand, that has got a graduate program, a PhD program where you can learn this stuff.
Nice. So you're part of the next generation that we are waiting.
Yeah, that's the hope. And I actually got into MMT before I came here. I'm actually here because of MMT. Then there's a handful of students like that. But, I was kind of self-teaching heterodox economics in the wake of the 2008 crisis. And I just got interested in, what's going on in the world and how should we understand it. And orthodox economics didn't seem to offer too many useful answers to that. So I found the heterodoxy somehow, and I found my way to MMT, and it was kind of touch and go there. I barely made it. I mean, I heard somebody mention it in passing a couple of times, and I kind of was like, I should find out what that is. And then the only source I could find at the time was Ray's book, Understanding Modern Money, the 1998 book. And if you guys have tried to read that one, it's a tough read.
Yeah.
I think it's chapter 3 is like 50 pages or something on the history of money. And boy, I'll tell you, I barely made it through that chapter. And he's a brilliant economist, but that chapter is a bit of a slog. But I kind of kept pushing through, and I made it through the book, and my mind was blown, so to speak. And I kept digging, and I read a handful more books before I kind of thought all my questions were answered and my concerns put to rest. And then I was kind of like, this is huge news and everybody needs to know about it. Not just, the academia people in the ivory tower, but just folks on the street need to get how this stuff works. And I was on Facebook one day and I happened to stumble on a page for the Tea Party Patriots. In the U.S. at a few years back, there was this big Tea Party movement, kind of right-wing movement. And I thought to myself, if the Tea Party can have their own social media page, how come deficit owls don't? Right. The MMTers should have one. So I just started it.
Can you remember the first time you saw an MMT insight that switched it on for you?
It would have to be while I was reading that book, Understanding Modern Money, because I really didn't know anything about MMT before I read that. And I made the horrific mistake of reading it on my phone. Don't read books on your phone, kids.
Oh God, your eyes.
But yeah, I mean, he talks about taxes not paying for spending, and the government spends first, taxes later, and it, like a light switch, flipped in my head, and suddenly it all kind of made sense, and I realized I had been wrong about all kinds of stuff before, and
you've been looking at the whole thing upside down.
Exactly. And, the hardest thing with this MMT stuff is getting people to listen, because once they listen, if you can get them to flip that switch, then they are on our side. It's like almost nobody goes back. There's quibbles here and there, but people don't say like, oh yeah, I totally got that, and I think I'm going to go back to this other thing. Like, people don't do that.
When you put the paper out to us, people who follow you on Twitter as Deficit Owls, you gave us a handy little thread. I thought we could go to the conclusion of that thread, and then you could talk us through your paper from there. So the conclusion says, if our citizens and leaders these days better understood the role of our monetary system in World War II, then we could mobilize again, not for battle, but to address the existential challenges of today. Not to wage war, as Morgenthau might have put it, to wage an active and continuous peace. So take it from there, Sam.
Sure. I mean, there's a really great quote from Beardsley Rummel in that piece that the MMTers talk about often, the taxes for revenue are obsolete piece. And I think it might even be in the first sentence. And he says, like, the war has taught the government and the government has taught the people how the monetary system works. And I think maybe the second part of that is not really true. The government did not teach the people very well. They tried. But that first part, I think, is true. The war taught the government how the monetary system works. And I don't think it was really unique to World War II, per se. I think it's probably happened just about every time they get into one of these big society threatening crises where actually, we have to drop all the, dogma BS and just do what we need to do and get it done. And that's kind of when you learn what you're really up against, and so a lot of people are thinking that this Green New Deal, this climate change issue is going to be a similar scenario where we're going to have to drop the BS, so to speak, and, use what we've actually got, put it to work.
Do you think that might happen? Because even the Green New Deal, it's quite a proactive policy. Do you think the danger is that people actually wait, for the shortages of water, for things to get really bad before they actually start mobilizing resources, I guess?
Oh boy. Well, on the one hand, I'm a relentless optimist, and I wholeheartedly believe we will do what it takes to get it done. Mm-hmm. However, if you ask me, when are we going to start doing what it takes to get it done? Oh man, that's a tough one.
Yeah. At the beginning of the paper, you start in on revealing the way the Treasury Secretary was thinking by sharing his passages of his writing in the paper, and there's some great quotes in there. And I mean, you pretty early on, you're like, well, "This guy's an MMTer."
Yeah, I mean, that's how I got into this. To writing this paper, I kind of got interested, in terms of the Green New Deal, I got interested in this war analogy, this mobilization analogy. So I got interested in a few aspects of that, including like war finance and specifically war bonds. And I got curious about like, how does that work? And so I started trying to find this historical material and see what they were saying, what they were thinking about at the time. And very, very quickly, it might even have been the first document I found, you find things that you would think that Stephanie Kelton had written, but then it says Secretary of the Treasury, 1943 or something like that, Yeah. I mean, it's kind of unbelievable for me. And the more I kept digging, the more it just turned up things that either would be like the exact things that would come out of our mouths today, the MMTers, or something that maybe, if not the exact wording, perfectly consistent.
Yeah, this is a great one. So this is a quote by Henry Morgenthau again. Quote, "The nature of the inflationary pressure inherent in diverting half of the income stream of the country to the government is simple. It is this: the value of all of the production of the country goes to its producers in the form of wages and salaries, rents, interest, dividends, and profits. But only half of this production consists of goods and services which are available to be purchased by these producers. The remaining half goes to the government for prosecuting the war. The problem is to prevent the people from trying to spend all of their incomes on half of the goods, and so merely bid up prices." I mean, that is time traveling Stephanie Kelton, isn't it?
Exactly. And if you listen to that quote, okay, what he's saying is the problem is people are getting paid to produce stuff that they can't buy. So right in there, people are getting paid already. You don't hear him saying, where are we going to get the money? You hear him saying, we are paying people. That's not the problem. The problem is now, what if they spend that money? There's nothing to buy. It might be an inflation problem. That's so when the MMTers say that, the cycle of government spending starts with the government spends money first into the economy, and then, on the other end, taxes it back out. I mean, that's exactly the way they were thinking. And it's all over these quotes.
Yeah. So let's just back up a little second here. I always say elevator pitch, and I always apologize for saying elevator pitch because nobody ever bought anything on an elevator. If you had to bumper sticky or the way you pitch MMT, the way you get somebody to understand the main insight of MMT, how do you do it?
I guess for me, one of the things that helps with that kind of light bulb moment is the problem is that people think of money as if it's a chunk of gold or a piece of paper, right? Which is the wrong analogy. If you get people onto a better analogy, then they'll make the connections themselves. So it's like the analogy that I prefer people to use is more like a gift card or a coupon, right? Like Mosler says there, the government issues tax credits. Right? If you can get people to think with that analogy, to think like, oh yeah, stores, when they sell gift cards, they don't collect gift cards from somebody they
Yep.
they don't collect the gift cards and then sell them. They just sell them and then they collect them back. Like, if you get people to think of money as a gift card or something like that, then people start making those connections for themselves. If you take your coupon back to the store, what are they going to? They're going to shred the coupon, right? Like, and why do you want the coupon? Because maybe they'll give you something nice for it. That's the carrot end of it. The government doesn't do the carrot so much. They do the stick. They'll do something nasty to you if you don't bring back the coupon.
The point is that these are not naturally occurring things that are dug out of the ground and distributed and broken up into coins. Like so what we're saying is, modern money is a creature of state, a creature of law, and it might, because we're talking about the history here. The period you were looking into when you were doing your research about the US Treasury and World War II, how does that relate to the gold standard?
So in the US, we went off the gold standard domestically in 1933, I believe. Internationally, we were still on the gold standard until 71 with the Nixon shock, but especially during the war period and even during a lot of that 33 to 71 period, gold wasn't a constraint on the U.S. In fact, during the war, we had large gold inflows, gold coming in from other countries because our allies basically were buying stuff from us,
And what was the trigger for, because I believe here the trigger was the war, the suspension of the gold standard. In the US, what was in 1933? Was that because of the crisis?
Yeah, it was the Depression, the bank crisis. 33, the bank crisis flared up again. That was the year of the bank holiday when they closed the banks and then reopened them like a week later with, under the new regulatory system that they were concocting at the time. It's kind of interesting. Morgenthau was Treasury Secretary for basically the entire Roosevelt presidency. And there is a stash of documents online where I drew a lot of this from, the Morgenthau diaries, which are basically his daily business and correspondence starting, right after Roosevelt takes office all the way to the end of the war, basically. So there's a treasure trove there. I mean, I looked into some of the gold standard stuff a little bit, but I didn't spend too much time on it because I was kind of more focused on this war issue.
Yeah, no, I just wondered, how far away from the gold standard it was in time, really.
No, totally.
The
answer is not long.
Yeah.
And that kind of thinking definitely permeated the government, at least until the war. I mean, I think I mentioned this in the paper, but one document I found from 1939, so only 2 years before Pearl Harbor, there was a meeting at the Treasury where all the Treasury officials basically voted unanimously that the biggest economic problem facing the government, fiscal problem, was that the deficit was too big. They needed to balance the budget because investors were uncertain. They weren't going to invest. It was slowing down the economy. So we got to get rid of the deficit so that, private investment will pick up. That's that's crazy talk in the lens of MMT and in the lens of what these guys were saying just 2 years later.
Yeah. Yeah. So
it's like believing in black magic for us.
Yeah.
So it's like what what you're saying, that cometh the hour, cometh the new paradigm. So straight away in your paper, they're not talking about collecting money to spend. Straight away, it seems to me, they're talking about inflation, like on the first beat.
Mm-hmm. That was basically, public enemy number one was, the Axis, and public enemy number two was basically inflation.
Yeah. This is a great quote. But I think this is Morgenthau again, and he says, inflation has been well described as, quote, the ruthless process whereby sacrifice is imposed inequitably upon a people who have lacked the unity, the courage, and intelligence to impose that sacrifice equitably upon themselves, unquote. It is for us to show that we have the unity, the courage, and the intelligence to check inflation now. It's a great, it's a great insight into what they were thinking. Let's get ahead of this. It's not because, when we're online today, slugging it out with people, some people say, "Oh, MMT your idea is spend until inflation, and then tax, and we don't trust politicians to do that." And to me, that's not MMT at all, right?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, I that's not really the kind of policy that MMT would say we need to have. Maybe most of the time, except maybe in this crisis time, you sort of have to do something like that. But just in general, in peacetime, that's not really what the MMTers are saying we should do. And then the other thing that I try to emphasize that I don't feel like gets brought up enough is that in the kind of economy where you need to raise taxes to prevent inflation is also the kind of economy, excuse me, in which raising taxes would be the most feasible, right? If you think about like the last 10 years in America, everybody feels squeezed, the middle class dying and all that. And then you have, somebody coming in and saying, "Oh, we're going to raise your taxes because inflation." And people go like, "Forget that, man. Like, I'm already squeezed to the bone, But the kind of inflation that we have is mostly like cost inflation, where taxes aren't really going to do anything about that anyway. And in a situation like this, like in the war, the reason they needed to raise taxes was because basically by definition, people have more money than they know what to do with. Like, that's the problem, is people have more money than they want to save really, or to use on necessities. And so they're just going out and buying stuff. And the government needs to say, like, you can't buy that stuff because we need that stuff. That is a radically different situation from where we are now. So, like, even if it were true that somebody was saying we'll need taxes to prevent inflation, people think about that through the lens of, recent experience, which is just completely wrong.
Well, the first thing I say to these kind of charges is actually the only policy in MMT is the transition job, the job guarantee. Everything else is describing. People might say, look, my MMT informed opinion about the way forward for the US is we've got a lot of fiscal space and we've got a lot of things that need doing, so let's spend. But that's not in MMT. The policy that is in MMT is the job guarantee, right?
Yeah, I agree and I disagree. Okay. I definitely agree that whether if we're talking about fiscal, using the fiscal space and whatever, then yeah, that could be a spending thing. That could be a lower taxes thing. There might even be something else. I definitely agree with that MMT is like nonpartisan in that way. It's not saying, MMT itself is not saying we have to build more windmills because we need jobs or something, right? But
yeah, do you care about cancer? Windmill cancer, it's a killer. I heard it on Fox.
But so I agree with that part. But I would say there are a few more policies that, in general, most of the MMTers, at least the academic MMTers, agree upon enough that you might call it MMT.
Is it the bonds, the drop in the interest rates at the
yeah, like most of them seem to agree that we should have low and steady interest rates, that interest rates aren't really a great tool for stabilizing the economy. It creates financial instability. And the better thing to do there is just take the park it approach, just park it low and steady. There's that. There's a few other ways that MMTers talk about controlling aggregate demand if we have to be in a situation like that, like credit controls. And even some of that is also like looking back to World War II and using that as an example of the kind of things they were doing to get aggregate demand under control. And then there's also the regulatory side, which doesn't get talked about as much. MMT inherits from Hyman Minsky on this stuff, on this like financial instability hypothesis, and like these long run trends in financial instability, and some options for reform. Like Mosler has got his article on proposals for reform of the banking system. And I wouldn't say I agree with everything in there, but the gist of it is probably, in line with what most of the MMTers would say.
So during the war in America, what was the approach that the government took to the selling of bonds and interest rates? Was it in line as well with MMT thinking?
During the war, this was, if you've heard in Japan right now, there's a thing going on that they're calling yield curve control, which is basically instead of the central bank just setting the short-term overnight interest rate, they're also setting rates on longer-term bonds, 5 years, 10 years. And that was pretty much what happened in the U.S. during World War II. The Federal Reserve did that kind of at the behest of the Treasury. It sometimes gets called the peg. They were pegging interest rates. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I hope I don't screw it up, but it's something like they were keeping Treasury bills, the 3-month bills, at 0.3%, and they were not letting the 10-year bonds rise above 2.5%. I think that's right. So a bit different policy than we have now, although central bankers are talking about, considering this yield curve control idea, in the next crisis. Who knows?
A few beats ago, you mentioned two types of inflation, and be good to just get a brief description of the two types.
Sure. So if I can zoom out a little bit before I do that,
yeah.
The way I think of inflation is with this is sometimes called the conflict theory of inflation or the conflicting claims theory of inflation. Basically, any economist, even a mainstream one, will tell you that if we're talking about negotiating on a price, buyer and seller, whatever, there's a conflict there, right? The buyer wants the lower price, the seller wants the higher price. They have to duke it out and figure out what the price is going to be. Mm-hmm. And this view of inflation interprets inflation as this, as that conflict, but unresolved, right? Conflict between two or more groups is leading to these spiraling prices because basically groups are trying to foist costs onto each other, but not succeeding. So the classic example of this is between labor and capital. So maybe capital decides that they would like a bigger share of, the real of the pie, a bigger share of GDP or whatever. And so they raise prices hoping to raise profits. Okay, so now you're a worker and you see prices go up, so your real wage has gone down. And so you resist that. You say wait a minute, I want that share of the pie. So you go to your employer and you try to raise your wage and to try and recapture that back. And if you have enough power to make that happen, then maybe you succeed and your wage goes back up and you've recaptured that slice of the pie of real resource output. But now prices and wages are both a little bit higher, right? And if the employer is not happy with that and they want to try and actually reclaim that, then they'll try and raise their price again to try and capture more. So it's about capturing more income, more share of national output. And so that example is labor and capital, and that sometimes gets called a wage price spiral. But it can be between anybody. So in the war, you had this, it's sometimes called demand pull inflation. But the way I've been thinking of it lately is really it's this conflict between basically the government and everybody else. The government is saying, we need more stuff for this war. We need all the metal. We need all the, nylon or whatever it is. We will pay any price for it. And they're bidding against other people in the hopes that those other people will go away, basically, that the government will get those resources and other buyers won't. But then other buyers still want those resources and they have more money because the government just paid more for stuff. So they try and bid against those resources. So you get this inflation when there's this unresolved conflict over who's going to get what share of the national output. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So that second type of inflation that you described, what's that commonly known as?
So that second type is often called demand pull inflation. Basically, when so many people are trying to buy stuff that they're bidding against each other for stuff that basically doesn't exist. There's we can make, whatever it is, a million cars per month, but people are trying to buy 3 million. And so they're bidding against each other for a limited share of however many cars there are. That's sometimes called demand pull. The other type that's commonly recognized is called cost push. basically something gets more expensive for some reason, maybe like the price of oil goes up or whatever, and then businesses are trying to pass that along, push that cost onto somebody else basically, so they raise their price. And then, that feeds into, well, if the cost of whatever it is, processed petroleum products is higher, then that makes, other things based on that higher. So those costs get pushed along through the system. And then, but what I'm kind of trying to say is, like, I think both of those two types of inflation are sort of a subset of this bigger conflict view of inflation. And the difference is really about who the conflict is with. Is it between buyers and other buyers, like maybe the government against consumers? Or is it between like workers and employers? Or, or maybe is it between like OPEC is trying to capture more share of world output and American consumers? You can get that cost push going. Or maybe it's between, like, in the war, during the war and World War I, a big problem was farmers trying to keep their share of income up. So, we sometimes talk about indexation. So that's like if your price gets tied to the inflation rate, then that can exacerbate inflation. Like if your like people talk about the minimum wage it's been losing to inflation. Things get more expensive, but the minimum wage doesn't go up. So those people are losing their share of real income. But okay, so maybe we tie it to inflation so that when inflation happens, then the minimum wage goes up automatically, okay, basically to preserve those people's living standards. But so imagine if we did that to every single price, right?
Sure.
That by itself would just create this huge spiral of inflation. As soon as one price went up a little bit, like all of the prices would have to go up to adjust, right? So this indexation thing itself can be very inflationary.
Because it's self-referencing, right?
Exactly. It's like a positive feedback loop. Mm-hmm. And during that era, there was something called parity in the United States, which basically the idea was that farmers were entitled to a certain share of income, basically a certain price on the crops. And like the price controllers, at first at least, weren't allowed to fight that. So if the price of certain products went up, then the price control people were allowed to say, like, you're not allowed to raise your price to basically anybody, except the farmers were allowed to raise their price until they had recaptured their share of income, right? So that by itself, so that's like a conflict between the agriculture sector and other sectors that can itself lead to spiraling prices.
We should just hammer it home that a lot of what you've found, and correct me if I'm wrong, is they're not talking very much in World War II about finding money to pay for the war.
That's correct. And there's a great quote in here, which I think I've got in front of me. So there was, during the war, they were keeping close tabs on what other countries were doing in all kinds of respects, obviously military, but that included finance. So one thing that I found was this memo in the Treasury there was an essay describing what was going on with German finances at the time. And the Treasury response to this essay, the essay was about how much they were borrowing, who was buying what bonds, how much the central bank was buying, yada, yada, yada. And in this essay, the quote is, in general, this kind of, quote, where did they get the money analysis does not constitute a very meaningful explanation of any system of war economies.
So straight away, they're not talking about finding the money. Almost instantly, they know they don't need to find the money.
Exactly.
They know they're the scorekeeper for the dollar, as Warren puts it.
You got Morgenthau writing things like, our problem has been something much more difficult than the mere raising of vast sums of money. And my problem is not simply one of getting more money. Like for them, finding the money was not really the issue. It was inflation.
So we've talked about these where inflation comes from, where it can come from, and pretty much when you get people interested in MMT and they understand that you're saying, look, we have a government with a sovereign currency, it can issue it at will. The only limit is inflation. And they kind of, some critics straight away go like they haven't heard you, and they go, yeah, but what about inflation? And then you go, yeah, you remember I just said the limit is inflation. And so inflation's probably the first pushback you get from somebody that's taken you seriously and followed you through with your your first MMT principle that taxes don't fund spending. The spending happens when the government spends the money into existence, when it keystrokes the dollars over to whoever it needs to pay, and so the first thing that they come back with is what about inflation? And here we've got a classic example of like real what about inflation. It's like we've got to get ahead of this. And so it wasn't just taxes that the government used in the US government used in World War II, was it? They used a variety of measures.
Yeah, that's true. Let me preface this by saying that a lot of the things that they did in World War II are not necessarily things that we want to do to fight inflation if we don't have to.
Sure.
But that situation they were in was like, they had to win the war. They had to beat Hitler. They had to spend the money at all costs, basically. Whatever they need to do to win the war, whatever the government needs to buy, however many tanks, whatever, they need to do it. And then on the back end of that, they'll try to stop the inflation that is definitely going to cause. In peacetime, governments don't and shouldn't take that approach. It should be more a question of, here is our pool of available national resources, how much should go to the government and for what purposes, and we'll kind of divide it up in that manner in a rational way. So the World War II example is not an example for peacetime.
Sure.
But it certain aspects of it could be an example for a Green New Deal when we face that situation of, again, we have to do it, whatever we have to do, we have to spend the money right now, and we'd plan ahead to know that spending this money could create an inflation problem if we don't do something about it. But that's what we'll have to do.
I'm personally very much enjoying all the advertisement that you've included in that paper, because it shows how this message was conveyed to the public. And I think MMTers can take great lessons from that. There is a paper here from the War Advertisement Council which says, "Mister, you're getting paid in dynamite," trying to explain the danger of splurging your pay package effectively. And it explicitly says, there are more pay envelopes today than there is stuff to buy with them.
Exactly.
And I love the dynamite thing, because in a way, America's trying to educate its own public to be thrifty and, to save. And at the same time, you're trying, obviously, in a war, one country is trying to cripple another country's production capacity in a way, and it's like you can consider it like almost like a war of inflation. You're trying to generate inflation in another country.
Yeah, that's happened in warfare in the past. Sometimes, actually, it happened during World War II. Like as Germany would retreat when the Allies were advancing in Europe, sometimes what they would do is on their way out of an area, they would just purposefully hyperinflate the currency.
How would they do that? I mean, just burn everything.
Just print up a ton of paper notes and just, throw them out into the street, basically.
So are we saying that there was like they were doing counterfeit notes?
Yeah, and that's happened in wartime too. I think it's the War of 1812, maybe, where one of the sides, basically tried to do that, create a bunch of counterfeit notes in your enemy's currency and just throw them into the streets. Can I talk about the saving thing for a minute? Because you mentioned this saving thing, and I think that's key to the paper and to what was going on in America at the time and other countries too. We can talk about Britain and the Keynes plan in a minute, but like we said, this kind of inflation, this demand pull inflation, you have too many people trying to buy stuff. The stuff they're trying to buy basically doesn't exist for them to buy it. There's not enough real resources. So, one solution to that gets the headline coverage is taxing. You basically take money away from people so that they can't or won't buy stuff. But another way that was used extensively during World War II was persuasion. Basically, convince people not to try to buy that stuff, convince them to save money. So the government is paying people to produce guns and tanks and stuff. And then on the back end of that, they say to people, please save your money. Do not try to buy stuff with it. Save it for the future. And so this ad here, this You're Getting Paid in Dynamite ad, it says that exact thing. It's saying, we're paying you money, but there is not stuff to buy, so we need you to save it. And then it lists a handful of different ways to save it, including buy government bonds is one way to save your money. But another way is pay down debt or buy life insurance or just park the cash under your mattress. That's good too. I mean, one contrast that I draw here between the orthodox conception, how people, the conventional wisdom on government spending versus this MMT and World War II Treasury vision is in the mainstream view. If the government needs a ton of money, then we're going to need people to buy government bonds so that the government can get that money. But in this view, you actually have them saying, okay, if you want to buy government bonds, do that. Or if you just save the money, just park it under your mattress or in your bank account, that's fine too. Really, we just need you to not buy stuff. That's what the government needed. Because that way, if you don't buy goods and services, then those goods and services are available for the government to buy to fight the war without trying to bid against you, to try to get a higher price than you to get it out of, to take it away from you, basically.
So, a way I like to talk about bonds, I'm sorry if it's too simplistic for a learned man such as yourself, but I just think, it's money that pays you money. So, they say, would you like to swap this money that's not paying you anything for some money that's going to pay you money? All you've got to do is not spend it. Just give it to us. We'll give you a token that says you gave it to us, and we'll pay you a dividend, and then we'll give it back to you after 2 years, after 3 months, whatever the maturity of the bond is. But it's money that pays you money. So the person that gives up their money for the bond is, they're doing it voluntarily. They're like, yeah, why, all I've got to do is not spend this, and I get, a 10% coupon rate or something like that.
Yeah, Warren Mosler calls this risk-free interest on government bonds a basic income for people who already have money. So like I said earlier, for the 3-month bills, it was about 3.87%. And for the longer, 10-year bonds, it was 2.5%. So not a lot. I mean, I think it actually is a little bit of maybe one of the parts of the war that was mishandled. Right. Not the interest rate per se, but so after the war, they actually did quite a good job of controlling inflation during the war. It peaked, I think, at 12% in the first year of the war, but then by the last year of the war, it was basically zero, even though the government was buying 50% of GDP and the deficit was 30% of GDP, so in terms of controlling inflation, that was a major success story during the war. But then after the war, I guess they let down the guard too soon is the way to think about it. And inflation surged in 46 and 47.
They were a bit tired, I think, after all those years.
They were definitely tired. I mean, like I said, the emergency methods they use to fight inflation are kind of unpleasant. It's like price controls and rationing and these saving campaigns and stuff. And so that's not something you can do forever. But also, they kind of had mistaken expectations. After World War I, there had been a post-war slump. The economy had suffered after the war. And my hypothesis here, without having dug into it too much, is that it was probably about the gold standard. Wars tend to be inflationary, and when you're on a gold standard, then what tends to happen is you can get a big inflation. People say you can't have inflation on the gold standard. That's not true. If you look back at the inflation rate in the U.S. for the gold standard era, we had huge inflations, right? But it's just that afterwards, then we would have huge deflations. This crushing, collapse of the economy. And so that's what happened after World War I. And that's what they expected to happen after World War II. One of the things they write that is very unfamiliar to today is they would list the reasons why they should fight inflation, and you get all the standard ones that you hear today. But one of them that they would also write was, we want to avoid a post-war deflation. That deflation will be painful. And so the better job we do at fighting inflation now during the war, the less we'll have to deal with a painful post-war deflation. So that's what they thought was going to happen. And they were completely wrong.
Right.
There was a hell of a lot of unemployment after the war, if it was in any way similar to the UK. And I guess the deflation happened regardless, right?
Well, right after the war, there's like the reconversion unemployment. So this is when all these plants that had been built to manufacture war goods and tanks and stuff, well, we don't need those anymore. So those have to get reconverted. So for a short time, a year or maybe two, there's some unemployment, not because there's not enough, aggregate demand to employ those people, but because the jobs just don't exist. The factories don't exist. We have to retool, convert the factory from producing tanks to producing, consumer cars or whatever. So there was unemployment for a short while for that.
So can I just interrupt your flow there? Really sorry to do this. But so I think this is a really good time to talk about what the job guarantee is. Because
sure.
You just said that unemployment came from this transitional period when the ordinary, everything was getting back to normal and people were just having to wait for the new jobs to come online. And that's where the unemployment came from. And really that type of unemployment is what the job guarantee is aimed at.
It would have helped to stabilize the whole thing.
What we're doing to the economy when we decarbonize it is disruptive. People are going to lose their jobs. So we need to guarantee that they'll have a job. It will be doing something productive, but these are not the green jobs going forward necessarily. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how you define the terms. Sure. Professor Forstater here, he likes to refer to them as green jobs, but by green jobs, what he means is, basically not dirty.
Do no harm.
Whatever you're doing. Yeah, exactly. Whatever you're doing, at least it's not making it worse.
Yeah.
So at least we want that. But then I do think there's room for some healthy debate about how much a job guarantee would be expected to contribute or not contribute to these specific kind of emergency efforts. When it's all hands on deck, then we kind of got to keep everything on the table about what we do or don't do. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the caricature that everybody in the JG is going to be installing solar panels, that misses the mark.
Yeah. I'm not saying I've literally seen that, but I just worry that people think, the entirety of the deficit is going to be about putting people into job guarantee jobs, and really it's and I think this is why Warren Mosler favors this term transition job. Just to get it into people's heads that let's say there wasn't a climate emergency. Capitalism is disruptive. It's like John Harvey says, the fundamental flaw in capitalism is it's an externalizing machine. It's looking to get more work out of fewer people. And the private sector is supposed to do that. It's not supposed to give everybody a job. And so,
right.
The government, there's only one way to cure that fundamental flaw is to guarantee everybody a job. That's the MMT solution. And so, like you say, after a big war and the economy is repurposing itself, there's potentially a load of unemployment.
Well,
and again,
a stabilizer would have come in handy, wouldn't it?
Exactly. So I'm saying, the way the job guarantee relates to the Green New Deal is it's kind of the other way around. We're declaring war on climate change. So as part of that war effort, some people are going to have, some types of industry are going to shed jobs, and they need to go somewhere to start with into what, like you say, did you say Matt Forstater or Scott Fulweiler was saying Forstater was saying that they are just whatever they are, they're not dirty jobs, so they're green jobs.
before we dig into that more, I just want to ask a question about because during the war here, and I'm pretty sure it was the same in the US, we also had, as you know, the kind of the marketing, the advertisement about saving, but also about things like grow your own vegetables at home, make your own clothes, turning people into very productive, as productive as they can be. And I wonder, as much as, the saving and the thriftiness and, all this kind of virtue, it's, selling these ideas.
Trying to change the culture.
Virtues. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'm wondering to what extent, that became a problem after the war, because people were still in that mentality. I mean, I imagine it's not like a switch, right? I mean, people were still saving. So
I think, as they say, that's a good problem to have. Home production was big here too. We had millions of here they were called victory gardens. People growing food at their own home. Personally, I love that idea. We just started a garden at my house. Not that I know anything about gardening, but I'm trying.
I can relate.
But
I'm happy if my plants don't die on me after a week.
I'm in London. I can so relate to that.
Yeah, and I mean, during the war, the focus was just on, we have to reduce demands on our very taxed food supply because we were sending food overseas. And so the more food that Americans can grow at home for themselves, the better. But, today, I mean, the environment implications, like if food is traveling halfway around the world, then surely it is better for the environment for you to grow it yourself.
So I kind of interrupted your wonderful flow to try and make this my clunky point about the job guarantee. We were talking about that unemployment right after the war in the States. You had a couple of years of high unemployment. Yeah,
it's not a long period. It's pretty short, because those kinds of adjustments can be made relatively quickly. But during that period, so there's kind of two problems. One is there aren't jobs for people just because the factories are getting retooled. They don't basically, the jobs don't exist yet. And the second problem is, while the factories are getting retooled, there still is not stuff to buy. During the war, that they were producing tanks and stuff. Now they're producing nothing. So government spending drops down because it doesn't need the tanks anymore. But the consumers, not only do they still want to buy stuff, but now they want to buy stuff more. The war is over and people are going like, can we please finally have a real standard of living here? And the longer the war is going on, people have been saving money that, they're waiting to spend. The government keeps telling people, hey, don't spend this money until the war is over. Well, now the war is over. Can we spend the money? So you have this problem of well, not yet, wait a little bit longer. And so I think between the pressures of that and also the mistaken expectations that were based on the World War I post-war deflation, basically they let down the guard too soon. The controls got let down too soon. And that's why you had that 46, 47 inflationary period.
We had a period of transformation after the war here as well. And I just want to read the quote by Tony Benn. Do you know who that is? I assume you do.
No, I don't.
It's a great politician we had here as a Labour Party politician. And he's actually interviewed by Michael Moore in a documentary, Sicko.
Okay.
And he talks about the kind of spirit that came after the war, that came, in here and ended in the creation of the NHS, the National Health Service. But in America, I've been to the Franklin Roosevelt Memorial, and he does talk about unemployment being the greatest ill and the one thing that he wanted to tackle. But what Tony Benn says, it's something very simple. He says, in 1945, the mood of the election that came in that then formed the National Health Service was, if you can have full employment by killing Germans, why can't we have full employment by building hospitals and building schools?
Yeah.
And it's a very simple idea, but is this notion that, why is that mentality abandoned right after the war? Yeah,
well, I mean, like you say, it didn't, in this country, I think people had seen that, we could spend we could do whatever we wanted. You know, I think people understood that the government had an infinite checkbook. Mm-hmm. You know, it didn't have infinite resources. It wasn't infinitely wealthy, but it had an infinite checkbook. So I think it did make people think, well, what do we want? Because that's what it goes back to. And it was when Warren Mosler came to talk in Glasgow and Edinburgh, he opened his talk by going, the first thing he said is, okay, what does Scotland want? Right, you might agree or disagree with this, but here's what I think you want, you know, and you know, I'm not telling you what to want, and I think very little of that is done in political discourse. Like, let's start with the real jumping off point. What do you want?
And then he talks as well about the differences between the economics of war and society, in a way criticizing the way, or, you know, saying things like, why can we understand in the military when we go to war, we want our soldiers to be healthy and, you know, we have full, free health service in the military. Why can we understand that those resources are valuable, but we don't carry those over to the rest of the population necessarily, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And
it's that mindset of scarcity that people have, you know, that like everything must be difficult. And if you're telling me something's easy, then, or that there's resources that are going unused, then, you know, the automatic reaction is to be suspicious of that. Like,
if I'm not suffering, it's a lie.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I always thought that was a British thing. You know, that's like, we were just
oh no, very American.
Really? Oh, okay. I just, you know.
Well, in America, it's not that I should be suffering; it's that everyone should be suffering.
Right.
And if I suffered, everybody else should suffer as well.
Yeah, we've got that here too.
Oh, that was Chomsky was talking about capitalism being tough love. Like, you know, love for me, tough for you.
Well, that's not the idea I get from reading The Great Gatsby, you know, and things like that, where everybody's splurging around.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you. They're hanging a big Sam Levey banner outside.
Yeah, they heard you were coming.
Very
they
happy.
Heard you were joining us.
Well, now that my ego's so inflated, thank you. Just like the prices. So,
nice segue.